There is a dream that human beings have carried for as long as they have understood what the stars are. Not the dream of visiting them, though that dream exists too, bright and persistent. This is an older, deeper dream, the dream of living among them, of building a community so complete, so self-sustaining, so carefully designed for the long passage of time and space that it could cross the incomprehensible distances between stars and arrive, generations later, with something intact, something worth preserving. People, knowledge, culture, the capacity to begin again in a new solar. This is the dream of the generation ship, and it is not merely a dream. In the last several decades, it has become a serious scientific and engineering subject, studied by physicists and biologists and sociologists and geneticists and systems engineers who want to understand not just whether a generation ship could be built, but what it would actually have to be. What conditions would allow human beings to live and reproduce and maintain a complex civilization across journeys measured not in years but in centuries? The questions are extraordinary. How large would such a ship need to be? How would it feed its passengers across hundreds of years? What social structures could persist or evolve across 10 or 20 generations of people who never chose the journey, who were born into it and will die in it without ever seeing a destination? How do you preserve technical knowledge when the engineers who built the ship are long dead and their grandchildren's grandchildren must maintain systems they no longer fully understand? And beneath all of these questions, the deepest one: how long can a generation ship survive? Not merely the physical structure, the metal and glass and pressurized compartments, but the human community within it, the social fabric, the genetic diversity, the accumulated wisdom, the willingness to continue. Tonight we explore this question, calmly, methodically, with the genuine wonder that it deserves. We will trace what science tells us about the requirements for a multi-generational voyage. We will visit the physics of deep space travel, the distances involved, the energies required, the timescales that no single human life can span. We will explore what biology demands of a founding population trying to maintain genetic health across centuries. We will consider the sociology of closed communities. What history and psychology tell us about how human groups behave when bounded and isolated over very long periods. And we will ask at the end what all of this reveals about what we are, about the nature of human civilization and its relationship to time, to commitment, to the transmission of purpose across generations that cannot personally remember why the journey began. The stars are patient, the distances are immense, the dream is old. If you love exploring the cosmos, a like and subscribe would mean the world to us. Let's begin. Before we can think about what a generation ship must be, we need to feel, genuinely feel, why interstellar travel requires generations in the first place. Because the distances involved are not merely large, they are a different category of large from anything in ordinary human experience. The nearest star to our Sun, Proxima Centauri, a small red dwarf in the southern constellation Centaurus, is approximately 4.2 light-years away. 1 light-year is the distance light travels in a year, moving at approximately 300,000 kilometers per second. 4.2 light-years is therefore approximately 40 trillion kilometers, a number that does not settle comfortably into the mind through direct comprehension. Let us try a comparison. The New Horizons spacecraft, launched in January 2006, and currently the fastest human-made object ever built, traveling at approximately 57,000 kilometers per hour relative to Earth, would take approximately 80,000 years to reach. Proxima Centauri, if it were aimed in that direction. 80,000 years. That is longer than modern Homo sapiens has existed as a species. It is longer than recorded human history by a factor of 16. even with propulsion systems far beyond current technology. Systems like nuclear, pulse drives, or laser sail concepts that remain theoretical. The journey to the nearest star would take decades to centuries. A spacecraft traveling at 1% of the speed of light, velocity requiring energy expenditure orders of magnitude beyond anything we have achieved, would reach Proxima Centauri in approximately 420 years. At 10% of the speed of light, currently considered an extraordinary aspiration that would require technologies not yet developed. The journey would take 42 years. The destinations most often discussed for generation ships, nearby sun-like stars that might host habitable planets, are generally further than Proxima. Tau Ceti is approximately 12 light-years away. Epsilon Eridani, approximately 10.5. The TRAPPIST-1 system, with its 7 rocky planets, is approximately 40 light-years from Earth, at 1% of the speed of light. Optimistically achievable in some theoretical scenarios. The journey to TRAPPIST-1 would take 4,000 years. At 10% of the speed of light, 400 years. These are the timescales. They cannot be wished away or engineered around. They are a consequence of the laws of physics and the structure of space. Any civilization that wishes to send people, living, breathing, reproducing people, to another star must design a community capable of surviving across these spans of time. This is the foundational problem. Everything else follows from it. The propulsion systems required for interstellar travel present engineering challenges that dwarf anything humanity has previously accomplished. Understanding these challenges helps us appreciate why the generation ship concept, slow, patient, multigenerational, may actually be more realistic than faster approaches. The fundamental problem of interstellar propulsion is the rocket equation. Every kilogram of mass you want to move requires fuel. That fuel has mass too, which must also be accelerated. The more fuel you carry, the more fuel you need to carry the fuel. This recursive relationship makes chemical rockets, which power all current spacecraft, completely inadequate for interstellar travel. Even the most energetically efficient chemical reactions produce exhaust velocities that would require fuel, masses thousands of times the payload mass for even modest interstellar velocities. Nuclear thermal propulsion, using the heat of nuclear fission or fusion to heat propellant, offers significant improvements, potentially achieving exhaust velocities 10 to 20 times those of chemical rockets. Nuclear pulse propulsion, explored seriously in the 1950s and 1960s under the name Project Orion, would use small nuclear explosions behind the spacecraft to drive it forward. Theoretical analyses suggest Orion-style designs could achieve velocities of several percent of the speed of light with achievable engineering, though the technology would be enormously complex, and the regulatory and political challenges of launching nuclear devices into orbit are significant. Fusion drives, using the controlled fusion of hydrogen isotopes to generate thrust, remain theoretically attractive and practically distant. Controlled fusion has not yet been achieved as a sustained net energy producing process in any terrestrial reactor. Extending fusion to a spacecraft drive, maintaining the reaction under the demanding conditions of an accelerating vessel in space, represents engineering challenges that may require centuries of development. Laser sail concepts, accelerating a thin reflective sail with a powerful ground-based or space-based laser, can in principle achieve the highest velocities of any currently proposed concept. For very small probes, gram scale or kilogram scale, lasers might achieve 10 to 20% of the speed of light. But for a generation ship, a vessel potentially hundreds of thousands of tons in mass, the laser power required would be staggering, and the engineering of deceleration at the destination remains largely unsolved. The practical consequence of this propulsion landscape is that a generation ship built from technology plausibly extrapolated from what we have today would likely travel at somewhere between 1/10 and 1% of the speed of light. This means journey times to nearby stellar systems of centuries to thousands of years. The generation ship must be designed for this duration. Everything else, the population size, the resource systems, the social structures, the genetic requirements, follows from this fundamental constraint. One of the most scientifically grounded questions about generation ship design is also one of the most counterintuitive. How many people do you need? The intuitive answer, a few dozen, perhaps a few hundred, turns out to be dangerously small. The science of population genetics has been working on related questions for decades. How large must a population be to avoid the genetic deterioration that threatens small, isolated groups? The answers, applied to a generation ship, suggest that the minimum viable population is significantly larger than most people would initially guess. Two related genetic risks threaten small, isolated populations. Inbreeding depression occurs when closely related individuals reproduce, increasing the likelihood that offspring inherit two copies of harmful recessive gene variants. Over generations, inbreeding increases the genetic similarity of the population, reduces the expression of beneficial heterozygosity, and allows harmful mutations to become fixed at higher frequencies. The consequence is reduced fitness, offspring that are less healthy, less fertile, less resilient than those of a genetically diverse population. Genetic drift is the second risk. In small populations, random chance plays a larger role in determining which genes are passed to the next generation. Beneficial variants can be lost by chance, simply because the individuals carrying them died before reproducing, or reproduced less. Harmful variants can spread by chance. Over many generations, genetic drift erodes the diversity that allows populations to adapt to new conditions. The critical parameter is effective population size, a measure of genetic diversity that accounts for factors like sex ratio, reproductive variance, and generational overlap. Effective population size is typically smaller than the actual census population. A landmark 2014 study by Cameron Smith, a biological anthropologist at Portland State University, analyzed the minimum population required for a multigenerational space voyage. His conclusion, that a viable founding population would require at least 10,000 individuals to maintain adequate genetic diversity over 500 years of travel, was larger than most previous estimates. Smith's analysis accounted for the risk of catastrophic population loss during the journey, disease, accident, equipment failure, and recommended founding populations in this range as providing a margin of safety. Other researchers have proposed smaller minimum populations. Some studies suggest that carefully managed breeding programs with awareness of genetic diversity could maintain viability with populations of around 500 to 2,000 individuals. But these smaller estimates depend on active genetic management, deliberate choices about reproduction that may be difficult to sustain over generations, and that raise complex ethical questions about reproductive autonomy. What all studies agree on is that the romanticized image of a small crew of explorers, 100 or 200 people making the cosmic crossing, is genetically untenable over the timescales involved. The journey to another star, lasting centuries, demands a community, not a crew. If the minimum population for a generation ship is in the range of several thousand individuals, the question of who constitutes that founding group becomes one of the most consequential decisions in human history. It is a question that intersects science, ethics, politics, and the deepest questions about what we value in human civilization. The genetic requirements provide one constraint. The founding population must represent sufficient genetic diversity, sampling broadly from the full range of human genetic variation rather than drawing from a single ethnic group or geographically localized population. The genetic diversity of humanity is largest in Africa, reflecting our species' origins and longest continuous habitation there. A founding population designed for maximum genetic resilience would likely be heavily drawn from populations that carry the greatest genetic diversity. Beyond genetics, the practical requirements of operating and maintaining a generation ship suggest that the founding population must collectively possess an enormous range of technical knowledge and skills. Engineers of all specialties, physicians and surgeons and genetic counselors, biologists and ecologists managing the ship's life support ecosystems, computer scientists and programmers maintaining the ship's computational infrastructure, educators to transmit this knowledge to subsequent generations, farmers and food systems specialists, psychologists and counselors to manage the inevitable stresses of isolated community life. The breadth of knowledge required is humbling. A generation ship must be, in microcosm, a complete civilization. Every technical capability that might be needed over centuries of travel must be present in the founding community, or at minimum, the knowledge base needed to train people in those capabilities must be preserved and transmitted. Cultural and creative traditions matter too. A community that survives for centuries while maintaining psychological health and social cohesion needs art, music, storytelling, ritual, and the full range of cultural practices that give human life meaning beyond mere survival. The founding group must include people who carry these traditions and who can transmit them to a population that will never know Earth except through memory and record. The selection problem has no clean solution. Any selection process favors some people over others in ways that carry profound ethical weight. The people who go are not necessarily those who most deserve to go. The people who stay have not chosen to remain. The foundations of the journey are built on decisions made by people who will die long before the ship arrives, decisions that bind generations not yet born. This is perhaps the most philosophically significant aspect of the generation ship, that it requires the most consequential of decisions to be made by people who will not live to see the consequences, binding people who have no voice in the choice. Even a well-chosen founding population of several thousand genetically diverse individuals faces genetic challenges as the journey extends across centuries and generations. Managing genetic health over 500 or 1,000 years requires systems and practices that no human society has previously needed to develop. The most immediate challenge is preventing inbreeding in a closed population. As generations pass, every individual aboard the ship becomes more closely related to every other individual. Family trees that begin as independent lines gradually converge. Without active management, the effective genetic diversity of the population declines over time. One technological approach involves the preservation of genetic material. Frozen sperm, eggs, or embryos from a much larger population, potentially tens of thousands of Earth donors, could be stored on the ship and introduced into the gene pool periodically throughout the voyage. By carefully selecting which stored genetic material is used in each generation, the ship's medical team could maintain effective genetic diversity far beyond what the traveling population alone would provide. This approach effectively multiplies the founding population's genetic representation without multiplying the number of living individuals who must be fed, housed, and supported. The storage technology required is not exotic. Cryogenic preservation of sperm, eggs, and embryos is well developed in modern medicine. The challenge is maintaining the storage systems reliably for centuries, ensuring the medical knowledge to use them appropriately is preserved and transmitted, and building the cultural norms and institutional frameworks that would encourage individuals to use stored genetic material rather than reproducing exclusively within the existing community. There are also genetic risks that arise not from lack of diversity, but from the accumulation of new mutations over generations. Every individual carries approximately 100 new mutations not present in either parent. Over many generations, some of these mutations are harmful, without the genetic mixing that occurs in large populations, where harmful mutations are diluted and rarely meet each other in the same individual. Small populations can accumulate harmful mutations over time through a process called mutational load. Addressing mutational load in the long term may require genetic screening and eventually direct genetic intervention, identifying and correcting harmful mutations before they are passed to the next generation. These are technologies that are in early stages of development today. The Creeper revolution in gene editing, beginning in the early 2010s, has opened theoretical pathways to this kind of genetic management. But translating laboratory demonstrations into safe, reliable, routinely applied clinical practice is a journey of decades, and extending that practice reliably across centuries of autonomous ship operation would require extraordinary institutional and technical robustness. The genetics of a generation ship ultimately is not merely a technical problem, it is a governance problem. Who has the authority to make decisions about genetic management? What norms govern reproductive choices in a community where individual reproductive decisions affect the collective genetic health of everyone? These questions have no easy answers in any human ethical tradition. Imagine for a moment that you are an engineer asked to design a vessel capable of housing 10,000 people for 500 years in the cold vacuum of interstellar space with no possibility of resupply or rescue. The design requirements alone would fill libraries. The vessel must be large, not merely in the sense of having enough living space, though that is essential, but in the sense of containing complete, functional ecosystems, industrial capacity, agricultural systems, water cycles, waste processing, and the thermal management infrastructure required to maintain livable temperatures in an environment where the ambient temperature is approximately 2.7 Kelvin, 3 degrees above absolute zero. Living space is the first and most visceral consideration. 10,000 people housed comfortably enough to maintain psychological health across generations require substantial area. Studies of psychological effects of density on human well-being suggest minimum figures of perhaps 20 to 30 square meters of personal space per individual plus communal spaces. Parks, meeting halls, recreational areas, open spaces where people can feel something other than enclosed, including agricultural areas, industrial spaces, and infrastructure. A generation ship might need to provide several square kilometers of usable floor area. The shape of the vessel has profound implications. A rotating cylinder, the classic design proposed by physicist Gerard O'Neill in the 1970s, uses centrifugal force to simulate gravity. People living on the inner surface of a rotating cylinder experience a pseudo-gravitational pull directed outward. The health benefits of sustained gravity, preventing the bone density loss, cardiovascular deconditioning, and fluid redistribution that occur in prolonged weightlessness, make rotation essentially mandatory for a multi-generational voyage. Human bodies that develop from childhood without gravity would face potentially serious long-term health consequences. The size of the rotating cylinder is determined by the desired gravity level and the acceptable rotation rate. Faster rotation produces more gravity with a smaller cylinder, but also produces Coriolis effects. The sense that falling objects curve, that motion in certain directions feels different from motion in others, that become disorienting above approximately 2 rotations per minute. A cylinder of approximately 1 kilometer in radius rotating at about 1 rotation per minute would produce approximately Earth normal gravity with minimal Coriolis discomfort. A habitable cylinder of 1 kilometer radius and say 5 kilometers length would provide approximately 30 square kilometers of inner surface, enough for a substantial community. The structural mass of such a cylinder, built from materials strong enough to maintain its shape under rotation, would be enormous, potentially millions of tons. The ship's outer structure must also protect inhabitants from 2 primary radiation hazards: galactic cosmic rays, which are high-energy particles that penetrate most materials with ease, and any stellar radiation encountered during the journey. Adequate shielding for cosmic rays requires significant mass. Water, ice, and regolith are effective shielding materials, and a generation ship might be designed to use its water supplies, stored in tanks surrounding the station cylinder, as radiation shielding. The architecture of a generation ship is ultimately an attempt to build a world, not a vehicle that crosses a world or visits one, but a world complete in itself, self-sustaining, designed to endure. Of all the technical challenges facing a generation ship, the management of food and water across centuries may be the most demanding. In space, there is no resupply. Every molecule of water, every calorie of food, every breath of air must be accounted for, processed, and recycled. The life support system of a generation ship is not merely a technical subsystem. It is the foundation on which everything else depends. Water presents a somewhat more tractable challenge than food, because water can be recycled almost completely if the system is well designed. Modern closed-loop water systems, developed for the International Space Station and studied extensively by NASA for long-duration missions, can recover approximately 93 to 96% of water from all sources: humidity, urine, perspiration, washing. The remaining few percent must be made up from stored supplies or from chemical reactions that produce water as a byproduct. For a 10,000-person community on a 500-year voyage, even a small daily loss of water per person accumulates to enormous quantities. The starting water inventory must be very large, or the recycling efficiency must be extraordinarily high, or both. Ice-rich asteroids and comets might serve as sources if the ship's route takes it past such bodies during its first decades of travel, while still within the outer solar system. Beyond that, the ship must manage with what it carries. Food is more complex, because growing food requires energy, volume, and biological systems that are themselves complex and can fail. A generation ship large enough to sustain its population must be, in part, a farm, an intensive, sophisticated, meticulously managed farm, but a farm nonetheless. The caloric requirements of 10,000 adults and children are substantial. Meeting them entirely through hydroponic and aeroponic cultivation, growing plants without soil, in controlled environments, requires significant dedicated growing area, artificial lighting, nutrient management, and careful crop selection. Studies of minimum agricultural area requirements for closed-loop human nutrition suggest figures of approximately 50 to 200 square meters per person depending on diet and cultivation efficiency. For 10,000 people, this implies 500,000 to 2 million square meters of growing area, 50 to 200 hectares. The crop mix must balance caloric density, nutritional completeness, water efficiency, and resilience. Root vegetables, legumes, leafy greens, grains, and fruits each contribute different essential nutrients and can be grown with different levels of space and energy efficiency. Animal proteins, whether from insects, fish in aquaculture systems, or more conventional livestock add complexity but also nutritional completeness and psychological variety. The ecological complexity required is significant. A genuine closed-loop agricultural system is not a simple garden. It is an ecosystem with microorganisms in the growing media, with waste decomposition pathways, with the complex interdependencies of a food web that must remain stable over centuries. Managing this complexity, preventing the ecosystem collapses that can devastate monoculture systems, maintaining the diversity of soil microbiome that healthy plant growth requires, adapting the agricultural system to the changing needs and preferences of a population across many generations, is a challenge that requires expertise and careful institutional management. The consequence of failure is not merely hunger. In a closed system, the failure of food production is a threat to the entire voyage. Designing redundancy, multiple independent food production systems, stored abundant reserves, the capacity to rapidly expand production in a surviving system if one fails, is essential. Life support across centuries is not a problem to be solved once. It is a problem to be managed continuously by people who understand it deeply enough to adapt to the unexpected. Transmitting that understanding across generations is itself a challenge. Human beings are social animals. We have always lived in groups, and the character of those groups, their governance, their social hierarchies, their shared beliefs and rituals and stories, shapes what individuals within them become. The social world of a generation ship would be the most deliberately constructed human community in history, and the history of deliberately constructed communities, while imperfect as a guide to a situation so unprecedented, offers important lessons. The most relevant historical analogues are not other space missions, which have been too short and too different to inform multi-generational dynamics. They are isolated communities, ships at sea for long voyages, polar expeditions, monastery communities, island populations, and, perhaps most relevantly, closed intentional communities that have attempted to maintain distinctive social structures across multiple generations. Closed communities face a consistent set of challenges. Social hierarchy tends to emerge and solidify. Initial founding principles tend to drift, whether toward extremism or toward dilution, depending on which social pressures dominate. Interpersonal conflicts become amplified in the absence of exit options. The ability to leave or to import new people, new ideas, new social from outside is one of the most important regulators of social health in ordinary communities. Remove it, and the dynamics change fundamentally. The inability to exit is the defining social characteristic of a generation ship. For the individuals born mid-voyage, who constitute most of the population through most of the journey, there is no choice about being aboard. They were born into the voyage. They will die in it. The destination is real only in theory, and the decisions that put them there were made by people who have been dead for generations. This creates a distinctive psychological and social situation with no true historical precedent. The people most affected by the decisions about the voyage had no say in making those decisions. The people who made the decisions will not live to see their consequences. The moral weight of this situation is extraordinary. Historical experience with isolated communities suggests that social stratification is a powerful and persistent force, whatever the founding principles of the community. However egalitarian the initial design, hierarchies tend to form. Knowledge becomes power. Technical skills become hereditary. Social structures that seem provisional in the early voyage become entrenched across generations. Managing this tendency, building institutions that prevent the emergence of a permanent ruling class, controlling essential ship functions, is among the most important social design challenges. At the same time, Historical experience shows that isolated communities can maintain remarkable social cohesion when they share a strong sense of common purpose. Communities built around genuine shared meaning, religious communities, communities united by a common cultural identity, communities with a specific shared project, can maintain unusual levels of cooperation across long periods. The voyage itself could serve this function. The journey to a new world, the preservation of humanity's reach into the cosmos, the carrying of a precious cargo of knowledge and people to a new home, if that meaning can be maintained across generations. But meaning also drifts. The people who were most passionate about the voyage, who sacrificed the familiar world to join it, are gone within the first few generations. Their descendants inherit the purpose without choosing it. How to transmit genuine commitment to a project across generations of people who did not choose the project is a question that religion, culture, and political philosophy have all grappled with, without arriving at any reliable universal answer. Every human community requires governance, some system for making collective decisions, resolving conflicts, allocating resources, and maintaining the rules that allow people to live together. The governance of a generation ship faces challenges, unlike those of any political system in human history. The most fundamental challenge is that governance structures designed for a century may be completely inappropriate for the 5th century of the voyage. The circumstances will have changed. The people will be different. The problems will be different. A constitution written by the founders, people who understood the early voyage but could not predict its evolution, may contain provisions that become actively harmful in later generations. Yet the founders must establish some governance structure because a community without governance collapses. The question is how to design a structure that is stable enough to maintain social order across centuries but flexible enough to adapt to circumstances that cannot be predicted. The temptation to design an authoritarian system, a technically competent elite maintaining order through control of central ship functions, is understandable but historically dangerous. Technical competence does not reliably produce wisdom. Elites with unchecked power reliably abuse it across every culture and every historical period. A system that places essential ship functions, life support, propulsion, food production, entirely under the control of a small group creates the conditions for exactly the kind of tyranny that makes closed communities intolerable. Democratic systems face a different challenge in the generation ship context. Democratic legitimacy rests partly on the idea that the governed choose their governors and can choose different ones if the current governors fail. But what does it mean for subsequent generations to have chosen the voyage? They didn't, and can they vote to turn back? By the time they exist, turning back would be as difficult or more difficult than continuing. The governance systems that might work on a generation ship probably look more like a constitutionally constrained republic than either pure autocracy or pure democracy, with written principles that protect individual rights and limit the power of technical elites, combined with representative institutions that give the community genuine voice in collective decisions, combined with appointed or meritocratic bodies that manage technical systems under oversight. The critical insight from political philosophy is that no governance system is self-maintaining. Every system requires active maintenance. People and institutions that understand the principles behind the rules, believe in them, and work to uphold them when they are under pressure. Transmitting that understanding across generations, not just the rules themselves, but the reasoning behind them, the historical experience of what happens when they are violated, is the deeper governance challenge. And then there is the question of who has authority over the mission itself. If the community, by democratic process, votes to stop the voyage and settle at an intermediate destination, or to return to Earth, or to fundamentally alter the design of the destination community. These questions reveal the tension at the heart of generation ship governance, between the commitment made by the founders and the autonomy of the people who must actually live the journey. The psychological health of the generation ship's inhabitants is not merely a humanitarian concern. It is an operational necessity. A community of psychologically distressed people, suffering from the cumulative effects of isolation, confinement, hopelessness, and social conflict, cannot maintain the complex technical and social systems on which survival depends. Understanding what human psychology requires in a closed, long-duration environment has been informed by research on analogous situations. The longest continuous human spaceflight, Russian cosmonaut Valery Polyakov's 437 days aboard Mir, provided early data on psychological responses to prolonged isolation. Research stations in Antarctica, particularly those that overwinter in complete isolation for months at a time, have provided extensive data on how small groups behave and how individuals cope in conditions of extreme isolation. Submarine crews, prison populations, and monastic communities have all contributed to an understanding of closed community psychology. The consistent findings point to several critical factors for psychological well-being in closed environments. Privacy is essential. Even in a community where social connection is valued, individuals need space and time that is genuinely their own. Autonomy matters deeply. The sense of being able to make meaningful choices about one's life, work, and relationships is a fundamental human need that confinement threatens. Purpose provides resilience. People who understand why they are doing something difficult, who feel that their effort contributes to something larger than themselves, cope significantly better than those who feel trapped in purposeless confinement. The specific psychological risks of a multi-generational voyage include the problem of third-generation nihilism, the observation from studies of intentional communities that the founding generation is sustained by conviction, the second generation by loyalty, and the third and subsequent generations increasingly by nothing in particular. Without genuine personal investment in the mission's purpose, the individuals of later generations may experience a kind of existential drift, living in a situation not of their choosing, unable to leave, without the personal conviction that their grandparents carried. Nature, or its simulation, matters psychologically more than was once understood. Access to living plants, to irregular natural landscapes, to something that is not entirely manufactured and geometric, significantly improves psychological well-being in isolated environments. The garden areas of a generation ship would not be merely agricultural. They would be psychological infrastructure as essential as water recycling or hull integrity. Meaningful work is another critical factor. Studies of long-duration isolation consistently show that idle people in closed environments fare poorly. Purposeful activity, especially activity that has tangible results and contributes to communal welfare, is protective. A generation ship community in which everyone has genuinely important work to do and knows why it matters is psychologically healthier than one in which automation has reduced human work to leisure and maintenance tasks. The social dynamics of the voyage would inevitably include conflict, personal, professional, ideological, generational. The generation ship must have effective mechanisms for resolving conflict that do not escalate to violence or permanent social fracture. This is not a secondary consideration. In a closed community with no exit option, unresolved conflict festers and spreads. Consider the problem from a single sharp angle. The founders of the generation ship include, among thousands of people, a team of nuclear engineers responsible for maintaining the ship's propulsion systems. These engineers understand deeply not only how to operate the drive, but why it works. The physics of the fuel cycle, the thermodynamics of the reactor, the metallurgy of the containment structures, the failure modes and how to diagnose them. In 50 years, those engineers are old or dead. Their children have grown up hearing about nuclear engineering and may have studied it. But have they internalized the deep intuition of practitioners? The troubleshooting judgment that comes from years of working with the system until you understand it in your hands as well as your mind? In 100 years, the grandchildren of the founders are operating the drive that their grandparents built. In 200 years, great-great-grandchildren are maintaining systems built by people who have been dead for a century. The erosion of technical knowledge in an isolated community without external information flows is one of the most serious risks facing a long-duration voyage. It has historical precedent. The technological knowledge of many ancient civilizations, Roman concrete formulations, Greek fire, certain methods of glass-making, was genuinely lost for centuries, not because the written records disappeared, but because the tacit knowledge, the practiced understanding, the craftsman's intuition was not successfully transmitted. The generation ship must address this with systems and structures more robust than any previously developed. Documentation of all critical technical systems must be extraordinarily comprehensive, not just operating manuals, but educational materials at all levels, from introductory to expert, that allow someone starting from scratch to develop genuine competence. Video records of experts working, explaining their reasoning as they go, the tacit knowledge made explicit. Apprenticeship structures that ensure critical skills are actively transmitted from practitioners to learners in each generation. Redundancy in knowledge holders is essential. For every critical technical role, the ship community must have multiple individuals competent enough to teach others. No critical capability can rest in a single person. Cultural knowledge presents related but distinct challenges. Languages change over generations. The English or Mandarin or Spanish spoken on departure becomes something different after 500 years of isolated evolution, as different, perhaps, as medieval English from modern English. Cultural practices evolve. Histories are remembered imperfectly and then re-remembered. The founding generation's memory of Earth, of forests and oceans, and the sound of rain and the smell of soil becomes increasingly abstract in subsequent generations. The preservation of Earth's cultural heritage, art, music, literature, history, philosophy, requires not only enormous digital libraries but active programs to transmit this heritage across generations. The danger is not that the data is lost. Digital storage is increasingly reliable, and multiple redundant systems can preserve data effectively. The danger is that the heritage becomes mere data, preserved but not alive, archived but not practiced, available but not understood. A generation ship community that loses its sense of connection to Earth's cultural heritage loses something essential to its identity as a human, civilization, and becomes gradually something else. Not necessarily something worse, but something that may be psychologically and socially unprepared for the challenges of arriving at a new world and attempting to build a human community there. Perhaps the deepest philosophical challenge of the generation ship is one that cannot be solved by engineering or genetics or governance design. It is the ethical problem of binding future generations to a decision they did not make. The people who travel on a generation ship in the later generations, the 5th generation, the 10th, the 20th, did not choose the voyage. They were born into it. They will live their entire lives in it, and they will die before reaching the destination. For them, There is no before and no after. The ship is the world. This is not in itself entirely unlike the situation of every human being. None of us chose to be born into the society, the century, the circumstances we inhabit. We inherit the consequences of decisions made by people long dead, the borders of our nations, the economic systems we operate within, the environmental conditions of our planet. The generation ship is an extreme version of a universal human condition. But the extremity matters. The generation ship removes the possibility of exit, of emigrating to a different society, of choosing a different economic system, of organizing politically to change the conditions of one's life. These possibilities are narrow in ordinary life, but they are not zero. On a generation ship, they are genuinely zero. There is no other ship, there is no other solar system, there is no exit. The philosopher Hans Jonas developed the concept of the imperative of responsibility in this context of technological civilization's obligations to future generations. He argued that as human technological power extends its consequences further into the future, the ethical obligation to consider those future people becomes correspondingly greater. The generation ship represents perhaps the most extreme application of this principle ever contemplated. Every decision made by the founders echoes through centuries of lives that those founders cannot imagine, affecting people who cannot speak back to them. Some philosophers argue that the generation ship is therefore simply impermissible, that no group of people has the moral authority to commit future generations to a project of this kind, no matter how noble the purpose. Others argue that the circumstances of the voyage can be made good enough, the community comfortable enough, purposeful enough, free enough, that the absence of initial consent is morally offset by the quality of life provided to those born into it. There is no resolution to this tension that satisfies every ethical framework. What there is, perhaps, is an obligation to design the voyage with this tension in mind, to create a community that is genuinely good to live in, not merely for the founders but for their descendants. A generation ship designed as a prison, however comfortable, has failed its moral responsibility. A generation ship designed as a home, a genuine, flourishing community with meaning and beauty and freedom within its necessary constraints, is at least attempting to honor what it cannot fully justify. The human challenges of a generation ship, genetics, psychology, governance, culture, are matched by an equally daunting set of mechanical and technical challenges. The ship itself must function for centuries with no possibility of resupply of parts, no rescue if something critical fails, and declining engineering expertise as the original designers and builders recede into history. Consider the timescales involved. The oldest continuously operating mechanical systems we can point to on Earth, certain industrial mills, certain water management systems, have operated for a few centuries with continuous maintenance, replacement of worn components, and the active attention of people who understand the systems deeply. No mechanical system has operated autonomously in a hostile environment for 500 years without fundamental intervention from the outside. The generation ship must do something like this. Its hull integrity must be maintained against the slow accumulation of micro-damage from cosmic ray impacts, thermal cycling, and the ordinary stresses of a pressurized structure in vacuum. Its propulsion system must continue to operate for decades at a time, because in interstellar space, no rescue is possible if the drive fails. Its radiation shielding must remain effective. Its rotating habitat must spin correctly for centuries without bearing failure. The approach to this challenge requires what engineers call deep redundancy combined with repairability. Every critical system must have multiple independent backups, and the backups must have backups. If the primary water recycling system fails, A secondary system continues operating while repairs are made. If the secondary fails before repairs are complete, a tertiary system handles the load. The depth of redundancy is determined by the probability of failure and the consequences of total loss. But redundancy alone is not enough. Eventually, every component fails, and if it cannot be replaced, redundancy merely delays the inevitable. The generation ship must be capable of manufacturing replacement components, of mining or recycling the raw materials needed to make whatever breaks. It needs, in effect, an industrial base. Metalworking, polymer production, electronics fabrication, the whole range of manufacturing capabilities need to reproduce itself from basic materials. This is a significant mass and volume commitment. A shipboard manufacturing system capable of producing the full range of components needed for ship maintenance is not a small workshop. It is a significant industrial infrastructure with energy demands and volume requirements that must be designed into the ship from the beginning. The alternative, and it is an imperfect alternative, is to design for extreme longevity from the start, using materials and manufacturing methods that minimize maintenance needs. Passive systems where active ones are not essential, designing for robustness rather than efficiency, accepting additional mass in exchange for systems that simply do not fail as often. Solar sails, for example, have essentially no moving parts and require no fuel. They are propelled by the pressure of light. A generation ship accelerated initially and then coasting with minimal active propulsion systems during the cruise phase has fewer mechanical systems to maintain than one requiring constant active propulsion. The relationship between technology and time on a generation ship is one of gradual entropy, systems slowly degrading, knowledge slowly eroding, complexity slowly becoming harder to maintain. The design challenge is to ensure that this degradation is slow enough and manageable enough that the community can keep ahead of it, always maintaining the ship better than it deteriorates. Every aspect of the generation ship, from navigation to life support to medical records to cultural heritage archives, depends on information systems. The ship's computers are, in effect, its memory, its nervous system, and its institutional knowledge repository. The long-term maintenance of these systems across centuries presents challenges that are different from, but no less serious than, the physical maintenance of mechanical systems. Digital storage is more reliable than many people assume. Modern solid-state memory, stored correctly, can preserve data for centuries without degradation. Magnetic tape, surprisingly, is one of the most long-term reliable storage media currently known. Properly stored tape can maintain data integrity for 50 years or more, and repeated archiving processes can extend this indefinitely. For a generation ship, multiple independent storage technologies, solid-state, magnetic, even optical, provide the redundancy needed to ensure that critical data survives hardware failures. The greater challenge is software. Computer software does not degrade like hardware, but it does become obsolete, incompatible with evolved hardware, and increasingly opaque to people who did not write it. The generation ship's operating software, the programs controlling life support, navigation, manufacturing, medical systems, must remain comprehensible to the people who must maintain and adapt it across centuries. This argues against the kind of highly optimized, architecturally complex software that modern computing often produces. A system that is elegant and efficient when it is written may be opaque and unmaintainable a century later, when the original developers are long dead and their design decisions undocumented. The generation ship software should be, by design, as simple and as thoroughly documented as possible, prioritizing comprehensibility over optimization. The artificial intelligence question is worth considering carefully. a sufficiently capable AI system, one that could autonomously diagnose and repair ship systems, manage agricultural ecosystems, guide medical care, and navigate through the interstellar medium, would address many of the technical maintenance challenges of the long voyage. It would be, in some respects, the most valuable crew member, tireless, comprehensive, never subject to the genetic drift or cultural erosion that threatens the human community. But AI dependence creates its own risks. A system sophisticated enough to manage the ship autonomously might, over centuries of operation, without update or external oversight, evolve in ways that its designers did not predict. Its goals might subtly drift. Its decisions might become increasingly opaque to the human community it serves. The power dynamics between a community dependent on an AI system and that AI system are inherently asymmetric and in the long run unpredictable. The generation ship's information architecture needs to be designed for comprehensibility and maintainability by human beings with AI assistance rather than AI dependence. The humans must be able to understand and override the systems they depend on. This is not merely a safety principle. It is essential for maintaining human agency and self-determination across the centuries of the voyage. After centuries of travel, after the founding generation is memory, after the 10th generation has grown up knowing the ship as home and the destination as myth, the generation ship approaches a new solar system. What the travelers find there will determine everything. The most optimistic scenario involves an Earth-like planet in the habitable zone of a sun-like star, a world with liquid water, a nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere, stable climate, and conditions broadly similar to Earth. Finding such a world would make the colonial project far simpler, though still enormously demanding. The more realistic scenarios involve worlds that are habitable in some form but different from Earth in significant ways. A world with higher gravity or lower, an atmosphere that requires modification, terraforming, in the terminology of science fiction, before it can support human life without life support equipment. A world with native microbial life that may interact with arriving Earth organisms in unpredictable ways. A world that is cold or dry or geologically active in ways that require careful site selection for the first settlement. Even the most optimistic scenario presents enormous challenges for the arriving community. They must transition from a self-contained ship community to a planetary settlement. The skills required for planetary colonization, geological survey, construction, agriculture adapted to a new ecosystem, mining, infrastructure development, are different in important ways from the skills required to maintain a ship community. The generation that arrives is the product of 500 years of ship life. Are they prepared for a planet? This suggests that the final generations of the voyage should include specific preparation for arrival, deliberate training in skills needed for planetary settlement, study of whatever is known about the destination world, planning for the specific challenges likely to be encountered. The voyage's educational systems cannot simply transmit ship maintenance skills indefinitely. In the final generations, the curriculum must shift toward planetary colonization. The transition from ship to planet is also a profound psychological and social transition. A community that has been organized around maintaining the ship. The hierarchies built around technical expertise in ship systems, the social structures adapted to the confined environment, must reconstitute itself for an open world with fundamentally different challenges and opportunities. The people who arrive are, in important ways, the product of a culture built in a container. Adapting that culture to an open landscape, to weather and seasons and geology and distance, is not trivial. The founding of a permanent civilization on a new world, if the voyage succeeds, is the ultimate purpose of the generation ship. but it is a purpose that the people who execute it will approach as the inheritors of a project they did not originate, the fulfillment of a promise made by people they know only from history, in a world that would have seemed completely alien to those people. Let us ask the question that the documentary's title invites, with the full weight of everything we have explored. How long can a generation ship survive? The physical answer depends on the engineering, on the quality of the redundancy, the depth of the manufacturing capability, the robustness of the life support systems. A very well-engineered ship with excellent redundancy and repair capability, and a community competent to maintain it, could plausibly survive the physical voyage to a nearby star. The timescales are challenging but not clearly impossible. Centuries of continuous operation in a protected environment for a well-designed system with active human maintenance. This is not obviously beyond what careful engineering could achieve. The genetic answer is somewhat more optimistic paradoxically, with a sufficiently large founding population, several thousand individuals, and with preserved genetic material from a larger donor pool available. For use across the voyage, genetic viability can be maintained across centuries. The biology is tractable in principle, even if the social management of genetic diversity is complex. The social answer is the hardest. Can a human community remain cohesive, purposeful, and functional across 20 or 30 generations? This is the question for which history provides the least reassurance. Communities do change across generations, values shift, purposes drift. Social structures that were functional in one era become dysfunctional in another. The founding generation's commitment cannot be inherited automatically. And yet, human communities have maintained identity and purpose across timescales under conditions of isolation. Religious communities have maintained distinctive practices and values across centuries. Cultural traditions have survived enormous disruptions of time and geography. The capacity for humans to transmit meaning across generations, imperfectly, with drift and evolution, but recognizably, is a genuine feature of our nature. The generation ship will not arrive at its destination as the same community that departed. It will be something that grew from that original community, carrying its heritage, shaped by its decisions, but transformed by 500 years of experience, evolution, and the relentless pressure of the journey itself. What survives may not be the specific individuals, or even the specific social structures of the founding community. What survives, if the voyage succeeds, is something more fundamental and more precious. The continuity of human civilization across an interstellar distance. The transmission of knowledge, of culture, of the capacity to build and sustain communities across a span of time and space that no individual life can encompass. This is what the generation ship concept is really about in its deepest form. Not the preservation of any particular community or culture, but the extension of humanity's reach. The demonstration that mind and meaning and civilization can survive the crossing of the dark between the stars. Whether that is possible, whether a single human community can carry that weight across centuries, remains genuinely unknown. We have not tried. We may not try for centuries or ever, but the dream persists. It is worth pausing before the conclusion to ask why the generation ship concept matters now, not in centuries when interstellar travel might be technically feasible, but today, in a time when the nearest star is as unreachable as it has ever been. The generation ship thought experiment is valuable precisely because of its extremity. It forces us to think carefully about questions that are genuinely important, but that ordinary life obscures. What does human community actually require across very long timescales? What are the true minimums, genetic, social, psychological, technical, for a self-sustaining human civilization? What obligations do present generations owe to future ones? What is worth preserving, and how does preservation actually work? These questions are not merely academic preparations for a voyage that may never happen. They are questions that human civilization faces right now, in the context of the challenges of the 21st century. The biological questions, what minimum genetic diversity is required for population viability, how to manage the health of a bounded population, are relevant to conservation in biology, to the preservation of endangered species, to the management of isolated human communities that already exist on islands and in remote regions. The social questions, how to maintain community cohesion and purpose across generations, how to transmit knowledge and values without coercion, how to design governance that remains legitimate and functional over long periods, are among the most pressing challenges of contemporary civilization. The technical questions, how to design systems that are both resilient and comprehensible across very long operational timescales, how to ensure that the knowledge required to maintain complex systems is genuinely transmitted rather than merely recorded, are directly relevant to the management of nuclear waste, to the design of critical infrastructure, to the governance of powerful technologies. The ethical questions, what obligations do we have to people who do not yet exist? What decisions is it legitimate to make on behalf of future generations? Are at the heart of climate policy, of economic planning, of environmental management. The generation ship thought experiment is valuable, not because we will build generation ships in the near future. It is valuable because thinking carefully about how to keep a human civilization alive and meaningful across centuries of isolations forces clarity about what civilization actually is and what it requires. Somewhere in the future, perhaps centuries from now, perhaps millennia, a ship might leave the solar system. It would carry people, living, breathing, wandering people who would sleep and wake and eat and argue and love and study and build and die aboard it. Their children would grow up knowing no other sky than the interior of a rotating cylinder. Their grandchildren would learn about Earth from records and stories. Their great-grandchildren would be the inheritors of a project so ancient to them that its origins would feel mythological. And through all of that time, through all those generations of ordinary human life, lived in extraordinary circumstances, the ship would continue, maintaining itself, sustaining its people, moving at some fraction of the speed of light through the cold dark between the stars. The question of how long such a ship could survive has no simple answer. It survives as long as its engineering holds, and as long as its community holds, and as long as its purpose holds. These three things, the physical, the social, and the meaningful, must all persist together because the failure of any one of them ends the voyage. The engineering is tractable. With sufficient care and redundancy and manufacturing capability, a ship can last centuries. The biology is tractable. With sufficient genetic diversity and careful management, a population can remain healthy across generations. The social and the meaningful, these are harder. These are the parts that depend not on material science or genetics, but on the deepest human capacities for commitment across time, for the transmission of purpose, for finding meaning in circumstances not chosen, for building community in confinement. And these capacities, these fragile, extraordinary human abilities to care about something larger than oneself, across timescales longer than a single life, are not only relevant to a generation ship, they are the same capacities that every generation of human beings must exercise on behalf of the generations that come after. We are all, in a sense, crew members on a voyage we did not choose, toward destinations we will not reach, maintaining systems built by people who are gone. We transmit what we know to people who will use it in ways we cannot predict. We make decisions whose consequences extend beyond our own lives. We carry a civilization forward, imperfectly and provisionally, from one generation to the next. The generation ship is an extreme and clarifying version of what all civilization already is. The stars are patient. The distances are immense. The dream is old and honest. And the question of how long a generation ship can survive is, in the end, a question about us. About whether we can be the kind of people who keep something precious alive across the darkness between here and wherever we are going. Thank you for spending this long, quiet evening with us, thinking about the longest journey, for sitting with questions that are bigger than any single human life, and finding in them not anxiety but something more like awe. The ship sails on in the dreams the stars wait.